Hey there. Before we dive into this incredible story, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you're ready for a tale that will touch your heart and restore your faith in humanity, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Now, let me take you on a journey that will change everything you think you know about love, deception, and redemption. The October morning mist clung to the glass towers of Manhattan like a shroud of uncertainty. In his 42nd floor penthouse overlooking Central Park, David Harrison stood before floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city wake up below. His reflection stared back, a successful 35-year-old entrepreneur with tired eyes that hadn't truly smiled since his wife Maria's death 3 years ago. "Dad, are you sure about this?" 9-year-old Michael's voice carried a mixture of excitement and doubt as he watched his father rummage through old clothes in the storage room. David pulled out a torn flannel shirt and worn-out jeans that looked like they hadn't seen better days. "Michael, sometimes we need to see people's true hearts. Today we're going to discover who in this city actually cares about strangers." The boy's intelligent brown eyes, so much like his mother's, studied his father with the wisdom of a child who'd grown up too fast. "But why do we have to pretend to be poor?" David knelt down to Michael's eye level, his hands gentle on his son's shoulders. "Because when people think you have nothing to offer them, that's when their real character shows. Your mother always said that kindness without expectation of reward is the purest form of love." 30 minutes later, father and son stood in David's private bathroom, deliberately messing up their appearance. David rubbed dirt on their faces and hands, while Michael giggled at their transformation in the mirror. "We look like we're in a movie," Michael exclaimed, his natural joy breaking through despite the somber purpose of their mission. "Remember," David said, adjusting the worn baseball cap on Michael's head, "we're Joe and Joey Harrison from the Bronx. I lost my construction job last month, and we're just trying to get by." The limousine dropped them 6 blocks away from Times Square. As they walked through the bustling streets, David felt an unexpected nervousness. Harrison Construction was worth $42 million, and he'd never experienced genuine need. Today he would see his city through completely different eyes. Times Square assaulted their senses with its typical chaos: honking taxis, street performers, tourists with clicking cameras, and the constant hum of 8 million people pursuing their dreams. David and Michael found a spot near the red steps and sat down with a small cardboard sign: "Father and son, anything helps, God bless." The first hour was brutal. Hundreds of people passed by without even acknowledging their existence. David watched expensive shoes step around them, heard fragments of conversations about stock portfolios and weekend getaways to the Hamptons. A few tourists threw coins at their feet without making eye contact, as if they were street decorations rather than human beings. "Dad, this is harder than I thought," Michael whispered, leaning against his father's shoulder. "Nobody even looks at us." David's arm tightened around his son, a protective instinct flaring as he witnessed his child experience society's indifference. "I know, buddy, but maybe that's the point. Maybe we needed to learn this." A businessman in a $3,000 suit walked by, talking loudly on his phone about closing a deal. He tossed a quarter toward them without breaking stride, the coin bouncing off David's leg. The irony wasn't lost on him. He probably knew this man from various charity galas where they'd competed over who could write the largest check for tax benefits. "Excuse me, sir." David looked up to find a young Latina woman crouched beside them. She wore a simple blue uniform, the kind worn by office cleaning crews, and her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail. But it was her eyes that captured him immediately. Warm, concerned, genuinely present. "Are you okay?" "You've been sitting here for hours," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that spoke of roots in a different place. "Perhaps Puerto Rico or the Dominican Republic." "We're—" David started, then remembered his character. "We're doing our best, miss. Just trying to get by." The woman's attention shifted to Michael, and David saw her expression soften with maternal concern. "And this little guy?" "Are you hungry, sweetheart?" Michael nodded, playing his part but also genuinely moved by this stranger's kindness. "A little bit, ma'am." The woman, David noticed her name tag read Sarah Martinez, opened her worn purse and pulled out a small bundle of crumpled bills. David's trained eye counted approximately $14. Listen, I don't have much, Sarah said, pressing all the money into David's hand. But take this. Make sure the boy eats something warm, okay? There's a deli 2 blocks that way. They make good sandwiches, not too expensive. David stared at the money in his palm, overwhelmed. This woman had just given them everything she had. Ma'am, we can't take all your money. You need this. Sarah's smile was radiant despite their surroundings. Honey, I get paid Friday. I'll figure something out. But this little one. She gently touched Michael's cheek. Children shouldn't go hungry. My mama always told me, God puts people in our path for a reason. What's your name? Michael asked, his young voice filled with genuine curiosity. Sarah. Sarah Martinez. She stood up, brushing dust off her uniform. I work nights cleaning offices around here. I'll be back around 6 if you're still here, okay? Maybe I can bring you something from the cafeteria. As Sarah disappeared into the crowd, David sat in stunned silence. In his world of boardroom negotiations and strategic partnerships, he'd forgotten that such pure generosity existed. Michael tugged at his sleeve. Dad, she gave us everything. Everything she had. David nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. Around them, Times Square continued its relentless pace, but something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't just a test anymore, it was a revelation. But as the afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows between the skyscrapers, David Harrison had no idea that this moment of unexpected grace would set in motion events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about love, family, and the dangerous power of deception. David couldn't sleep that night. He paced the marble floors of his penthouse, Sarah's face haunting his thoughts. The way she'd looked at Michael with such genuine concern, the way she'd given everything without hesitation, it awakened something in him that had been dormant since Maria's death. I want to see her again, he told his reflection in the bathroom mirror at 3 a.m. The next evening, David and Michael returned to Times Square in their disguises. Sarah appeared at exactly 6:15 p.m., carrying a small bag from a nearby deli. Joe! Joey! She called out, her face lighting up when she spotted them. I was hoping you'd still be here. She sat down beside them on the sidewalk, completely unbothered by the dirt and noise. I brought sandwiches, turkey and cheese. I hope that's okay. As Michael bit into his sandwich with theatrical hunger, David found himself studying Sarah's profile. She was beautiful, but not in the polished way of the socialites he knew. Her beauty was authentic, unguarded, earned through struggle rather than gifted by genetics and personal trainers. So tell me about yourselves, Sarah said, settling back against the building wall. How long have you been in the city? David slipped into his character easily. Born and raised in the Bronx, construction work was good until the company downsized. Been looking for work for 2 months now. And Joey's mom. The question caught David off guard. Michael looked at his father uncertainly. She passed away 3 years ago, David said quietly, the truth slipping through his fiction. Cancer. Sarah's hand found his arm, her touch warm and comforting. I'm so sorry. That must be incredibly hard, raising him alone. Some days are better than others, David admitted, surprised by his own honesty. My parents died when I was 15, Sarah shared, her voice steady but distant. Car accident. I've been on my own since then, so I know what it's like to feel lost. Michael leaned against Sarah's shoulder, and she instinctively wrapped an arm around him. David watched this natural gesture with fascination. In his world, every interaction was calculated, measured, but Sarah's affection was spontaneous, genuine. You know what? Sarah said, standing up with sudden energy. It's getting cold out here. I live about 20 minutes away in the Bronx. It's not much, but there's a couch and it's warm. You're welcome to stay tonight. David's pulse quickened. This was moving faster than he'd anticipated. We don't want to impose nonsense. Sarah gathered her things. Besides, Joey looks tired, and tomorrow I can help you look for work. I know people in construction. My friend Carlos runs a crew in Queens. 30 minutes later, David found himself in a small, one-bedroom apartment in the Bronx. The space was tiny but immaculately clean, filled with second-hand furniture that Sarah had obviously cared for lovingly. Family photos, mostly of her with an elderly woman, lined the windowsill. That's my abuela, Sarah explained, noticing his gaze. She passed 2 years ago. She raised me after my parents died. Michael had fallen asleep on the couch within minutes, exhausted by the day's adventure. Sarah covered him with a blanket that looked handmade, tucking it gently around his shoulders. "He's a good kid," she whispered. "Yeah, he is." David watched her tend to his son with the same care she might show her own child. "You're very kind to us." Sarah moved to the tiny kitchen, putting water on for tea. "My abuela always said, La vida es como un círculo, what goes around comes around. Maybe someday when I need help, someone will be there for me." They sat at her small kitchen table, drinking tea from mismatched mugs. David found himself opening up in ways he hadn't in years, sharing stories about Michael's school struggles and his own fears about single parenting. Of course, he adjusted the details. Private school became public school. The Upper East Side became the Bronx. "You're a good father," Sarah said as the night grew late. "I can see how much you love him. Sometimes I worry it's not enough." "Love is always enough," Sarah replied with quiet conviction. "Trust me, I know what it's like to grow up without it." When David finally lay down on the couch, Sarah had insisted he take it while she slept in her bedroom. He stared at the ceiling in wonder. This small apartment felt more like home than his $40 million penthouse ever had. But as comfort settled around him like Sarah's handmade blanket, a nagging voice in his head whispered a dangerous question. How long could he maintain this lie? 3 weeks into their deception, David had established a routine that terrified him with its complexity. Mornings belonged to his real life: boardroom meetings, construction site inspections, phone calls with investors. Afternoons and evenings belonged to Joe Harrison, the unemployed construction worker, who was falling deeper in love with Sarah Martinez every day. Michael adapted to the double life with the flexibility of childhood, but David caught him slipping sometimes. Like the day Sarah found an expensive toy in Michael's backpack. "Wow, Joey, where did you get this?" Sarah examined the limited edition action figure that cost more than she made in a week. Michael's eyes widened with panic. His friend at school let him borrow it," David interjected smoothly. "Rich kid whose parents buy him everything." Sarah's expression darkened slightly. "Be careful with it, okay? People like us can't afford to replace expensive things." That night, as they walked home from Sarah's job, she'd started letting them meet her after work. Michael tugged at David's jacket. "Dad, I don't like lying to her." David stopped walking, kneeling to face his son under a streetlight. Around them, the Bronx hummed with evening life, families calling children in for dinner, teenagers laughing on stoops, the distant sound of salsa music from open windows. "I know, buddy. I don't like it either." "Then why don't we tell her the truth?" David struggled with an answer. How could he explain that he was addicted to the way Sarah looked at Joe Harrison, with respect, affection, and growing love, compared to how women in his social circle viewed David Harrison, the wealthy widower? They saw dollar signs. Sarah saw his soul. "It's complicated," David said finally. "But she trusts us," Michael insisted with 9-year-old logic. "If she found out we were lying, she'd be really hurt. That's why she's never going to find out," David replied. But even as he said the words, he knew they tasted like poison. Their relationship deepened with each passing day. Sarah shared her dreams of going back to school, maybe studying social work to help kids who'd grown up like her. David found himself offering to pay for her education, as Joe, of course, promising that once he found steady work, they'd figure it out together. "You don't have to take care of me," Sarah protested one evening as they sat in her tiny living room. Michael was at the table doing homework, while Spanish-language television played softly in the background. "I want to," David said, and meant it more than any words he'd ever spoken. Sarah moved closer to him on the couch, her head resting on his shoulder. "I never thought I'd feel this way again." "Again?" "I was engaged once, when I was 22. Luis. He left when he realized I couldn't give him the kind of life he wanted. You know, money, status, all that." Her laugh was bitter. "Funny thing is, I thought I wanted those things too back then." David's chest tightened with guilt and irony. "What do you want now?" "This," Sarah said simply, gesturing around her modest apartment where Michael was helping himself to leftovers from the refrigerator like he belonged there. "A family. People who love each other for who they really are, not what they have." The words hit David like physical blows. Every sentiment was a mirror reflecting his deception back at him. "Mom's Sarah," Michael called from the kitchen. He'd started calling her that the second week, and Sarah had glowed with happiness. "Can we have pancakes tomorrow morning?" Of course, mijo, Sarah replied, unconsciously slipping into Spanish. But only if you finish your math homework. David watched this domestic scene with a mixture of joy and growing dread. Michael had never been happier. In Sarah's presence, he laughed more, smiled more, seemed more secure than he had since his mother's death. And Sarah, David could see how much she loved the child, how naturally she'd stepped into a maternal role. But it was all built on lies. Later that night, as Sarah slept peacefully beside him in her small bed, David stared at the ceiling and made a decision that would change everything. He would tell her the truth. Tomorrow, he would reveal who he really was and pray that what they'd built together was strong enough to survive the revelation. He had no idea that in 12 hours, his world would come crashing down in the most spectacular way possible. David chose Lombardi's, a small Italian restaurant in Greenwich Village, for his confession. The intimate setting felt safer than Sarah's apartment, where Michael might overhear, and more honest than anywhere too expensive that might hint at his deception before he was ready. Sarah wore her best dress, a simple navy blue number that she'd bought years ago for job interviews. She'd curled her hair and applied makeup carefully, excited about their first real date night. David had arranged for his nanny to watch Michael, telling Sarah that his friend from work was babysitting. "This is beautiful," Sarah said, looking around at the candle-lit tables and exposed brick walls. "Are you sure you can afford this?" David's stomach clenched. "I got a day's work yesterday, cash job. I wanted to do something special for you." They ordered modestly, Sarah insisting on the cheapest pasta dish, despite David's protests. As they shared a bottle of house wine, David memorized every detail of her face in the flickering candlelight, the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed, the unconscious grace of her gestures, the way she listened to his stories, the carefully edited versions he'd told her, with complete attention. "Joe," she said suddenly, reaching across the small table to take his hand, "I need to tell you something." David's heart stopped. "What?" Sarah's cheeks flushed pink. "I know we've only known each other for 3 months, but—" She took a shaky breath. "I love you. I love both of you. You and Joey. I know it's crazy and fast, but I've never felt this way about anyone." The words should have filled David with joy, but instead they felt like knives. Sarah was declaring her love for a man who didn't exist. "Sarah, I know we don't have much," she continued, her words tumbling out in a nervous rush. "I know my apartment is tiny and I work nights, and it's not the life most people would want. But we could build something together. A real family." David's resolve crystallized. She deserved the truth, whatever the consequences. "Sarah, stop. Please." He gently squeezed her hands, which were trembling slightly. "I need to tell you something. Something important." The happiness in her eyes began to dim, replaced by uncertainty. "What is it?" David took a deep breath, feeling like a man about to jump off a cliff. "My name isn't Joe Harrison." Sarah blinked. "What?" "My real name is David Harrison, and I'm not unemployed." The words came faster now, like a dam breaking. "I own Harrison Construction. I'm worth $42 million, Sarah. The day we met in Times Square, that was a test." Sarah's face went completely still. "A test?" "I wanted to see who in the city had a good heart, who would help strangers without expecting anything in return. So Michael and I dressed up like homeless people and—" "Stop." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through David's explanation like a blade. "Stop talking. Sarah, please, let me explain. You're telling me—" Sarah's voice grew stronger, edged with something David had never heard before. "You're telling me that you pretended to be poor, that you let me give you my last $14 when you're worth $40 million. I fell in love with you," David said desperately. "That first day, the way you treated us, the way you cared. You fell in love with me?" Sarah's voice rose, causing other diners to glance their way. "Or did you fall in love with feeling superior? With watching the poor little cleaning lady share her pathetic savings?" "It wasn't like that." Sarah stood so abruptly that her chair scraped loudly against the floor. 3 months, David. 3 months I thought I was helping someone who needed it. 3 months I shared my food, my home, my heart with someone who was laughing at me the whole time. I wasn't laughing. Do you have any idea," Sarah's voice shook with fury and humiliation, "what it's like to count every penny? To give someone your last money because you're worried a child might go hungry? And you You probably spent more on this dinner than I make in a month." Tears were streaming down her face now, and David felt his own eyes burning. "Sarah, please. What we have is real. My feelings for you are real." "Your feelings for who?" Sarah grabbed her purse from the table. "For Sarah, the cleaning lady? The poor girl who was so grateful for your attention? Would you have looked at me twice if you'd met me at some fancy charity gala in Manhattan?" The question hung in the air between them, and David's silence was answer enough. "I thought so." Sarah's voice was now deadly quiet. "Do you know what hurts the most, David? It's not the money. It's that you made me believe that someone could love me for who I am, but you never even knew who I am, did you? You just loved the idea of me, the noble poor person who made you feel good about yourself. That's not true." "And Joey," Sarah continued, her voice breaking. "God, that beautiful little boy. Does he even know what you did? Does he know his father used him as a prop in some sick social experiment? Don't bring Michael into this. His name isn't even Joey, is it?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "How many other lies did you tell me, David? How much of anything you shared with me was real?" David reached for her, but Sarah stepped back as if his touch would burn her. Don't you dare touch me." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her mascara. "I need to go." "Sarah, wait." But she was already walking toward the door, moving through the restaurant like a woman fleeing a fire. David threw money on the table and followed her onto the street, where the October wind cut through his jacket. "Sarah, please, just listen to me for 5 minutes." She spun around to face him, and the pain in her eyes nearly broke him. 5 minutes? You had 3 months, David. 3 months to tell me the truth. I was going to... When? After we got married. After I got pregnant. How long were you planning to keep me as your pet project? It wasn't a project. Yes, it was. Sarah's voice echoed off the village buildings. I was your charity case. The grateful poor woman who made you feel like a good person. Well, congratulations, David Harrison. You got exactly what you wanted. You found out who has a good heart. She started walking away, but then stopped and turned back one final time. For what it's worth, she said quietly, I would have loved David Harrison just as much as I loved Joe Harrison. But you never gave me that chance, did you? You never trusted me enough to find out. And with that, Sarah Martinez disappeared into the crowded streets of Greenwich Village, taking David's heart with her. David stood alone on the sidewalk for nearly an hour, watching strangers pass by, finally understanding what it truly meant to have nothing at all. Frank Harrison's corner office on the 55th floor of the Chrysler Building was a testament to old money and older prejudices. Oil paintings of deceased family patriarchs watched over antique furniture that had never been touched by middle-class hands. When his secretary announced that David was on his way up, Frank straightened his tie and prepared for battle. You look like hell, Frank said as his son entered without knocking. David's usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. Good morning to you too, Dad. David slumped into the leather chair across from his father's desk. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah walked out of his life, and David hadn't been the same since. Frank studied his son with calculating eyes. At 62, Frank Harrison had built a construction empire through ruthless determination and an unwavering belief in social order. Poor people stayed poor, rich people stayed rich, and anyone who tried to upset that balance was dangerous. I heard about your little experiment, Frank said carefully. David's head snapped up. What? The beggar disguise, Times Square. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? Frank leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. I have people who watch out for this family's interests. You had me followed? I had you protected. There's a difference. Frank stood and walked to his window, gazing out at Manhattan spread below them like a personal kingdom. This woman, Sarah Martinez. Tell me about her. There's nothing to tell, it's over. Good. Then you won't mind if I ensure it stays that way. David stood so quickly his chair nearly toppled. What are you talking about? Frank turned, his expression revealing the cold calculation that had made him rich. Son, you're worth $42 million. She's a cleaning lady from the Bronx. Do you see the problem? The only problem I see is you. Really? And what happens when she realizes what you're worth? When she starts making demands, claims she's pregnant, sues you for emotional distress? Frank's voice was calm, logical. I've seen it 100 times, David. Gold diggers come in all shapes and sizes. Sarah isn't a gold digger. They never are, until they are. Frank returned to his desk, pulling out a thick folder. I had Ms. Martinez investigated. Did you know she was evicted twice in her 20s? That she has $12,000 in student loan debt? That her credit score is barely above subprime? So what, being poor isn't a crime? No, but desperation makes people do desperate things. Frank opened the folder, revealing photos and documents. She gave you $14, David. 14. Do you know what she could do with 14 million? This conversation is over. David turned toward the door. Sit down. Frank's voice carried the authority of decades. I said I'd make sure it stays over, and I meant it. David paused, his hand on the door handle. What are you going to do? Nothing illegal, nothing that can't be undone if I'm wrong about her character. Frank's smile was predatory. But I'm going to test Ms. Martinez the same way you tested her, except my test will show you who she really is. Dad, I'm warning you. You're warning me? Frank laughed. David, I've been protecting this family since before you were born. I protected us when your mother tried to leave with half our assets. I protected us when that activist group tried to sue over the Brooklyn development. And I'll protect us from this cleaning lady. David felt ice forming in his veins. What are you planning? Frank's expression softened into something approximating paternal concern. I'm going to hire Ms. Martinez to clean our offices, pay her well, treat her kindly, and then I'm going to test her honesty. When she fails, and she will fail because they always do, you'll see her true colors. And if she passes your test, then I'll admit I was wrong and personally apologize. Frank's tone suggested he found this possibility unlikely. But David, when she shows you what she's really after, I want you to promise me you'll cut all contact. David stared at his father, seeing clearly for perhaps the first time the man who had raised him. Frank Harrison wasn't protecting their family. He was protecting his worldview, his belief that social classes existed for a reason and shouldn't be crossed. I won't let you hurt her, David said quietly. I'm not going to hurt her. I'm going to expose her. Frank pressed a button on his desk phone. Margaret, get me the number for Eagle Eye Cleaning Services. I'd like to request a specific employee. David wanted to storm out, to call Sarah and warn her. But a treacherous part of his mind whispered that maybe his father was right. Maybe Sarah's kindness in Times Square had been calculated. Maybe her anger about his deception was really fury at missing an opportunity. As he left his father's office, David tried to convince himself that Sarah would pass whatever test Frank devised. She would prove her goodness once and for all, and then maybe, just maybe, they could find a way back to each other. But in the elevator descending towards street level, David couldn't shake the feeling that he had just set in motion forces that would destroy the woman he loved, and he was too cowardly to stop them. That afternoon, Sarah Martinez received a call that would change everything. A prestigious cleaning company had specifically requested her for a high-paying job at Harrison Industries. She needed the money desperately, and it seemed like an answer to prayers. She had no idea she was walking into a trap designed by the man whose son had already broken her heart. Sarah stood in the marble lobby of Harrison Industries at 6 a.m., wearing her best cleaning uniform and carrying supplies that felt inadequate for the gleaming corporate temple around her. The security guard, a kind-faced man named Robert, checked her credentials with apologetic efficiency. "First day?" he asked, noting her nervousness. "Yes, sir. I'm here for the executive floor cleaning contract. 55th floor. Mr. Rodriguez will meet you at the elevator." Robert's expression suggested sympathy. Word of advice, he's particular about details. The elevator ride felt eternal. Sarah had specifically requested higher-paying commercial work to rebuild her savings after the emotional devastation of David's betrayal. 3 weeks of crying herself to sleep had accomplished nothing except giving her puffy eyes and a deeper appreciation for waterproof mascara. It was time to focus on practical things: rent, groceries, and putting her life back together. The elevator doors opened to reveal a distinguished Latino man in an expensive suit. Silver-haired and stern-faced, he looked like he'd never smiled in his professional life. "Ms. Martinez, I assume. I am Roberto Rodriguez, executive assistant to Mr. Harrison." His English was perfect, with just a hint of accent. "I will be supervising your work personally." Sarah shook his offered hand, noting its softness, hands that had never held a mop. "Thank you for the opportunity, sir." "Indeed. Follow me." Frank Harrison had chosen his disguise carefully. Roberto Rodriguez was a persona he'd used before when he needed to get close to people without revealing his identity. A good wig, contact lenses, and carefully applied makeup had aged him and changed his ethnicity convincingly. His background research on Sarah's Puerto Rican heritage suggested she might feel more comfortable with a Latino supervisor. "The executive floor requires special attention," Frank explained, as he led Sarah through corridors lined with expensive art. "These offices serve our most important clients. Everything must be perfect." Sarah nodded, already mentally cataloguing the scope of work. The floor was enormous, at least 20 offices, each larger than her entire apartment. "Your primary responsibility will be Mr. Frank Harrison's office," Frank continued, gesturing toward massive oak doors. "He is exacting in his standards." As Sarah entered Frank's office, she felt overwhelmed by its opulence. The Persian rugs alone were worth more than she made in a year. Family photos showed generations of Harrisons at various charity galas and society events. "Begin with the windows," Frank instructed. "Mr. Harrison insists they be spotless." For the next 4 hours, Sarah cleaned with meticulous care. Frank watched her work, making notes on a clipboard and occasionally offering critiques. "The corners need more attention. This glass has streaks. Dust the picture frames again." Each criticism felt like a small humiliation, but Sarah endured it with professional grace. She needed this job, and difficult supervisors were nothing new in her experience. "You missed this spot," Frank pointed to an already clean surface. Sarah bit back her frustration and re-cleaned the area. Something about Mr. Rodriguez's attitude felt personal, as if he was testing her rather than training her. But she couldn't afford to lose this position. "Tell me about yourself, Ms. Martinez," Frank said during her lunch break. "How long have you been in cleaning services?" 8 years, sir. I started part-time in high school." "And your family?" "I was raised by my grandmother. She passed away 2 years ago." Frank made notes, his expression revealing nothing. "Any romantic relationships? Boyfriend? Husband?" Sarah hesitated. The question felt inappropriate, but she sensed that her answer mattered somehow. "No, sir. I'm single." "Interesting. A young, attractive woman like yourself. That's unusual." Sarah felt her cheeks burn. "I prefer to focus on work, sir." "Of course." Frank's smile was cold. "Very professional of you." Over the following days, Frank's behavior became increasingly bizarre. He assigned Sarah to clean the same areas repeatedly, always finding new flaws. He followed her around the office, watching her work with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Mr. Rodriguez," Sarah finally said on her 4th day, "is there something specific you're looking for? I feel like nothing I do meets your standards." Frank pretended to consider her question. "Perhaps you're simply not suited for this level of work." The words stung, but Sarah maintained her composure. "I've been doing this job for 8 years, sir. My previous supervisors were always satisfied with my performance." "Different standards," Frank replied dismissively. "Here, we serve a more refined clientele." On Friday afternoon, Frank revealed his true purpose. He called Sarah into his office, where he sat behind the massive desk like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict. "Ms. Martinez, I've been observing your work this week." Sarah stood straight, preparing for criticism. "Yes, sir. I'm curious about something. Have you ever worked for someone wealthy before?" "I've cleaned homes in wealthy neighborhoods, yes. And did you ever take anything? Something small that wouldn't be missed?" Sarah's mouth fell open. "Excuse me?" "It's not uncommon," Frank continued conversationally. "People in your situation sometimes find temptation overwhelming. A small item here and there, perhaps something that could be sold." "Mr. Rodriguez," Sarah interrupted, her voice shaking with indignation. "I have never stolen anything from anyone I've worked for. Ever. Of course not. I'm simply saying it would be understandable. People from your background often have different moral frameworks." "My background?" Sarah's composure finally cracked. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Frank leaned back in his chair, satisfied that he was getting a reaction. "I think you know what I mean." Sarah stared at this man who had spent a week making her feel worthless, and suddenly everything clicked into place. The inappropriate questions about her personal life, the excessive criticism, the casual racism disguised as professional standards. "You've been testing me," she said quietly. "Have I? This whole week, you've been trying to push me to, what? Steal something? Quit? Prove some theory about people like me?" Frank's expression didn't change, but Sarah saw a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. "People like me," Sarah repeated, her voice growing stronger. "You mean poor people? Latino people? People who clean offices for a living?" "I mean people who prey on wealthy families," Frank said, dropping his pretense entirely. "People who see opportunity and decide to take what isn't theirs." Sarah understood now. This wasn't about cleaning standards or professional performance. This was about something else entirely. "This is about David," she whispered. Frank's mask finally slipped completely. "Very good, Ms. Martinez. Yes, this is about my son." Sarah felt the world tilt around her. The man sitting behind the desk wasn't Roberto Rodriguez, executive assistant. This was Frank Harrison, patriarch of the Harrison family, and he had spent a week systematically humiliating her. "You're David's father." "I am, and I'm here to make you an offer." Sarah's legs felt weak, but she remained standing. "What kind of offer?" Frank opened his desk drawer and pulled out a check. $50,000. Walk away from my son and never contact him again. Sarah stared at the check, seeing more money than she'd ever imagined holding. $50,000 would pay off her debts, secure her apartment for years, maybe even let her go back to school. "You think I was after David's money," she said slowly, "weren't you?" "No." Sarah's voice was quiet but firm. "I loved him. I thought he loved me." "Love?" Frank laughed bitterly. "Ms. Martinez, my son is worth $42 million. You make $12 an hour. Love doesn't bridge that gap." Sarah looked around the opulent office, then back at the check in Frank's hand. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what $50,000 could mean for her future. Then she straightened her shoulders and met Frank's eyes directly. "Keep your money, Mr. Harrison. I was never after David's fortune. But thank you for showing me exactly what kind of family he comes from." Sarah turned and walked toward the door, her dignity intact despite the week of humiliation. "You'll regret this," Frank called after her. Sarah paused at the door and looked back at him. "I regret many things, Mr. Harrison, but self-respect isn't one of them." As the elevator doors closed, Sarah allowed herself one moment of tears, not for the money she'd refused, but for the confirmation that David Harrison's world had no place for someone like her. She had no idea that Frank's schemes were just beginning, or that his next test would be far more dangerous than anything she'd yet faced. Frank Harrison sat in his study that evening, a tumbler of 30-year-old scotch in his hand, staring at the unsigned check on his desk. Sarah's rejection had surprised him, but it didn't change his assessment of the situation. If anything, it made her more dangerous. A gold digger he could pay off. A woman with genuine feelings for his son was a threat that required more sophisticated handling. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he'd memorized years ago. "Vincent, it's Frank Harrison. I need another favor." Vincent Torino ran a private investigation firm that specialized in what he called reputation management. His services weren't always strictly legal, but they were always effective. "What do you need, Mr. Harrison?" "Sarah Martinez, 28. Bronx address, I'll text you. I want her employment prospects eliminated. Quietly. Make sure she can't find work anywhere in the city." "The usual approach?" Frank smiled grimly. "Tell them she's a thief. Show them photos from security cameras. You know how to make it look convincing. Nothing that could be traced back to us, but enough to make her unemployable. Consider it done. Anything else?" Frank glanced at a photo on his desk, David and Michael at a charity gala 2 years ago, both wearing tuxedos and genuine smiles, before Sarah Martinez entered their lives and complicated everything. "I also want documentation that she's involved with another man. Something that would convince my son she's moved on. Photos? Whatever it takes. David needs to believe she never cared about him." After hanging up, Frank opened his laptop and began researching Sarah's social circle. Within an hour, he had identified her closest friends, her favorite coffee shop, and her regular routines. If Sarah Martinez thought she could simply walk away from his family without consequences, she was about to learn how wrong she could be. Meanwhile, in Sarah's small Bronx apartment, she sat at her kitchen table surrounded by unpaid bills and job applications. Frank's week of psychological torture had cost her other cleaning contracts, and her savings were nearly depleted. "It's going to be okay," she told herself, using the same words her grandmother had whispered during the hardest times. "People like us always find a way." But as the days passed, Sarah discovered that work was mysteriously difficult to find. Cleaning companies that had welcomed her before suddenly had no openings. Private clients who'd used her services for years stopped returning her calls. "I'm sorry, Sarah," said Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow on the Upper West Side who'd employed Sarah for 3 years. "Someone called and said there had been problems with missing items. I can't take that risk." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Mrs. Patterson, I've never stolen anything from you. You know that." "I thought I did, but—" Mrs. Patterson's voice was pained. "The person who called had photographs, Sarah, security camera footage showing you taking something from an office building. That's impossible. I'm sorry, I can't risk it." The same scenario played out 5 more times over the next week. Employers who'd trusted Sarah for years suddenly questioned her honesty, based on evidence that materialized from nowhere. On Thursday evening, as Sarah sat in her apartment wondering how she'd pay next month's rent, her phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number. "Sarah, it's David." Sarah's heart stopped. 3 weeks of silence, and now his voice filled her apartment like a ghost she couldn't exorcise. "David," she tried to keep her voice neutral. "What do you want?" "I need to see you. It's important." "I don't think that's a good idea." "Please, Sarah, just give me 10 minutes. There's something you need to know about my father." Sarah closed her eyes. She'd suspected Frank Harrison was behind her employment troubles, but hearing David's voice brought back all the pain of their last conversation. "Your father has already made his opinion of me very clear." "What are you talking about?" "He hired me to clean his offices, spent a week trying to humiliate me, then offered me $50,000 to stay away from you." Silence stretched between them like a chasm. "Sarah, I had no idea." "Of course you didn't. Just like you had no idea that telling me the truth might have been better than 3 months of lies." "That's why I need to see you. I have information about what he's been doing. He's not going to stop, Sarah. He's trying to destroy your life." Sarah laughed bitterly. "Mission accomplished. I can't find work anywhere in the city. Apparently I'm a thief now. Meet me tomorrow, 1 o'clock at the coffee shop on 145th, please." Sarah stared out her window at the Bronx streetlights, weighing her options. She could refuse, maintain her dignity, and watch her life slowly crumble under Frank Harrison's systematic assault. Or she could face the man who'd broken her heart and learn exactly how deep his family's cruelty ran. 1 o'clock, she said finally. "But David, this doesn't mean I forgive you." "I know," David replied quietly. "I'm not sure I deserve forgiveness." After hanging up, Sarah sat in her dark apartment and wondered if seeing David again would give her the strength to fight back, or if it would destroy the last pieces of her carefully guarded heart. Either way, she was about to find out just how far Frank Harrison was willing to go to protect his version of the natural order, and whether David had the courage to choose love over family loyalty. The coffee shop on 145th Street buzzed with Friday afternoon energy. Students from local colleges, mothers with strollers, elderly men playing dominoes by the window. Sarah arrived early, choosing a corner table where she could watch the entrance. Her hands trembled slightly as she wrapped them around her cup of coffee, the cheapest item on the menu. David appeared at exactly 1 o'clock, looking haggard in a way she'd never seen during their 3 months together. His usually perfect appearance was disheveled, wrinkled shirt, unshaven jaw, eyes that seemed to have forgotten how to sleep. "Thank you for coming," he said, sliding into the seat across from her. "You said you had information about your father." David pulled out a manila folder and placed it on the table between them. "Vincent Torino, private investigator. My father hired him to destroy your reputation and fabricate evidence that you're a thief." Sarah opened the folder, her anger building as she scanned the documents. Fake security photos, doctored timestamps, a detailed plan to systematically eliminate her employment opportunities. "How did you get this?" "I hired my own investigator to watch my father. I knew he was up to something when you mentioned the office cleaning job." David's voice was hollow. "Sarah, I am so sorry. I never wanted this to happen." "But you didn't stop it either." "I didn't know how bad it was until yesterday." David leaned forward, his eyes desperate. But I'm going to fix this. I'll call every employer he contacted, tell them the truth. The truth? Sarah's voice rose slightly, causing nearby customers to glance their way. Which truth, David? The one where you pretended to be homeless to test my character? Or the one where your father spent a week psychologically torturing me? Or maybe the truth about how your family sees people like me? David flinched as if she'd slapped him. My father doesn't represent how I feel, doesn't he? Because from where I sit, this looks like a family pattern. You tested me in Times Square, he tested me in his office. Both of you seemed pretty convinced that I'd fail. I was wrong, David said quietly. About everything. The test, the lies, thinking I could protect what we had by keeping you separated from my real life. Sarah studied his face, seeing genuine remorse, but also the same privileged blindness that had led to this mess. David, do you know what it's like to have $12 and give it all away? To choose between groceries and rent every month? No, I don't. Then how could you possibly understand why what you did was so cruel? You turned my kindness into a performance for your entertainment. David's hands clenched on the table. It wasn't entertainment. From the moment you sat down with us on that sidewalk, I knew you were special. The way you looked at Michael, the way you cared, you knew I was useful, Sarah corrected. A good story to tell yourself about finding authentic people in an inauthentic world. That's not fair. Fair? Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. David, nothing about this has been fair. Your father offered me $50,000 to leave you alone. Do you know how tempting that was? How much that money would have changed my life? But you turned it down. I turned it down because I thought what we had was real, because I believed that the man I fell in love with might actually exist somewhere inside all these lies. David reached across the table, but Sarah pulled her hands away. He does exist, David insisted. Everything I told you about my feelings, about wanting a family, about loving you, that was all real. Was it? Because Joe Harrison from the Bronx wanted those things. I'm not sure what David Harrison from the Upper East Side wants. Before David could respond, a commotion near the entrance caught their attention. Michael burst through the coffee shop door, followed closely by an older woman Sarah didn't recognize. "Dad," Michael called out, weaving between tables with 9-year-old determination. "I've been looking everywhere for you. Michael, what are you doing here?" David stood, automatically moving to intercept his son. "You're supposed to be with Mrs. Henderson." "I gave her the slip," Michael said proudly, then spotted Sarah. His face lit up with pure joy. "Mom, Sarah." Before Sarah could react, Michael launched himself into her arms, hugging her with the fierce affection of a child who'd missed someone desperately. "I've been so worried about you," Michael whispered against her shoulder. "Dad's been sad all the time and Grandpa Frank keeps saying mean things about you, but I know they're not true." Sarah held the boy, feeling her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. "Oh, mijo, I've missed you too." "I have something important to show you," Michael said, pulling back and reaching into his backpack. "Something about Grandpa Frank." David moved closer, suddenly alert. "Michael, what are you talking about?" Michael pulled out a small digital recorder, the kind children used for school projects. "I've been recording Grandpa Frank when he talks on the phone. Listen to this." He pressed play, and Frank's voice filled their corner of the coffee shop. "Vincent, I need you to plant evidence that she's seeing another man. David needs to believe she never cared about him, whatever it takes." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. David stared at the recorder as if it were a weapon. "There's more," Michael said, fast-forwarding. "Grandpa Frank has been planning all of this. He hired those people to call your bosses. He made up those pictures, and he's going to send Dad fake photos of you with some other guy next week." The recording continued, revealing the full scope of Frank's manipulation. His plan to isolate Sarah, destroy her reputation, and convince David that she'd moved on. Every cruel detail laid out in Frank's own words. "How long have you been recording him?" David asked, his voice barely controlled. 2 weeks. Ever since I heard him on the phone talking about hurting Mom Sarah." Michael looked between his father and Sarah with serious eyes. "I know what you both did was wrong, the lying about being poor and the fighting instead of talking. But Grandpa Frank is trying to keep our family apart, and that's worse." Sarah stared at this 9-year-old boy who'd just handed her the evidence to destroy his own grandfather. "Michael, why did you do this?" "Because you love us," Michael said simply. "And we love you. And Grandpa Frank is trying to ruin that because he thinks people like us shouldn't love people like you." The profound innocence and wisdom of childhood had cut straight to the heart of everything. Sarah looked at David, seeing her own emotions reflected in his face. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. David stood, his decision crystallizing. "Now we stop my father. And then—" he met her eyes directly. "Then we figure out if what we have is strong enough to survive the truth." Sarah looked down at Michael, who was watching her with hopeful eyes, then back at David. The evidence of Frank's cruelty was overwhelming, but the deeper question remained. Could she trust David Harrison the way she'd trusted Joe Harrison from the Bronx? "One step at a time," she said finally. "First, we deal with your father. Then we'll see." But as they left the coffee shop together, David, Sarah, and Michael walking side by side like the family they'd once pretended to be, none of them knew that Frank Harrison's most dangerous gambit was yet to come. Frank Harrison stood in his study, Vincent Torino's final report spread across his mahogany desk. The photographs looked convincing. Sarah apparently embracing a dark-haired man outside a restaurant in the village, the two of them walking hand in hand through Central Park, sharing what appeared to be an intimate dinner. "These should convince your son," Vincent said, admiring his handiwork. "The timestamps show they were taken this week, while he's been pining for her." "Excellent work." Frank signed a check and handed it over. "I trust these images will remain exclusive to our arrangement." "Of course. The man in the photos is an actor friend of mine. He's already been paid and briefed on the importance of discretion." Frank nodded, but before he could respond, his study door burst open. David strode in with purposeful fury, followed by Sarah and Michael. "Hello, Father." David's voice was ice. "I believe you know everyone." Frank's composure slipped for just a moment before reassembling into patrician calm. "David, I wasn't expecting you." "I'm sure you weren't." David placed Michael's recorder on the desk, right next to the fake photographs. "We need to talk." Frank glanced at the recorder, then at Vincent, who was suddenly very interested in finding the nearest exit. "Vincent, I think our business is concluded," Frank said smoothly. "Actually, Vincent should stay," Sarah said, speaking for the first time since entering. "Since he's been documenting my fictional affair, he might want to hear this." Vincent paused in the doorway, caught between flight and curiosity. Michael stepped forward with the confidence of childhood indignation. "Grandpa Frank, you've been very bad." "Michael, this is adult business. You tried to hurt Mom Sarah." Michael's voice rang with accusation. "I heard you planning everything." David pressed play on the recorder. Frank's voice filled the study, his manipulations laid bare in damning detail. As the recording played, Frank's face transformed from surprise to anger to calculation. "Very clever," Frank said when the recording ended. "But somewhat irrelevant." "Irrelevant?" Sarah stepped forward, her voice shaking with controlled fury. "You systematically destroyed my livelihood. You spent a week humiliating me. You hired people to lie about me." "I protected my family," Frank interrupted coldly, "which is more than I can say for my son, who apparently has no concern for the consequences of his reckless behavior." "Reckless behavior?" David moved between his father and Sarah. "Falling in love is reckless. Falling for a gold digger's sob story is reckless." Frank gestured toward the photographs on his desk. "But apparently you're not the only one she's been manipulating." David glanced at the photos, and Sarah saw confusion cross his face. For one terrifying moment, she wondered if he might actually believe what he was seeing. "Those are fake," she said quietly. "Are they?" Frank picked up one of the images, studying it with theatrical interest. "They look quite authentic to me." Vincent is very skilled at his craft. Vincent, who had been edging toward the door, suddenly found himself the center of attention. "Tell them, Vincent," Frank commanded. "Tell them about Ms. Martinez's romantic dinner with her new boyfriend." Vincent looked between Frank and David, clearly calculating which Harrison would be more dangerous to cross. David's expression suggested violence was a possibility. Frank's suggested career annihilation. Vincent started, then stopped. "Tell them the truth," Michael said, stepping forward with 9-year-old fearlessness. "Tell them you hired an actor to pretend to be Mom Sarah's boyfriend." Vincent's shoulders slumped in defeat. "The photos are staged, Mr. Harrison. Your father hired me to create them." Frank's mask of control finally slipped completely. "You little... Don't." David's voice carried a warning that made everyone in the room freeze. "Don't you dare say another word about my son." "Your son? Your son is being poisoned against his own family by this... By this what?" Sarah stepped forward, her dignity intact despite everything she'd endured. "Say it, Mr. Harrison. Tell us exactly what you think I am." Frank looked at Sarah with undisguised contempt. "You're a parasite, a leech. You saw an opportunity to improve your miserable circumstances, and you took it." "You're right," Sarah said, surprising everyone in the room. "I did see an opportunity." David's face went pale, and Michael moved closer to Sarah's side. "I saw the opportunity to love a man who made me laugh," Sarah continued, "to help raise a child who needed a mother, to build something real with people who mattered to me. That was my terrible crime, Mr. Harrison. I fell in love with your family." "Love." Frank spat the word like a curse. "You gave them $14. 14. Do you know what $14 means to someone like me?" "Nothing," Sarah replied. "It means absolutely nothing, just like I mean nothing to you. But do you know what $14 meant to me?" Frank remained silent. "It was everything, Mr. Harrison. It was every dollar I had in the world, and I gave it away because I thought a child might be hungry. Not because I wanted something in return. Not because I saw an opportunity. Because sometimes loving people means giving them everything you have." She turned to David, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "That's the difference between your father and me, David. He sees love as a transaction. I see it as a gift." David stared at her, and Sarah saw the exact moment when his last doubts dissolved. "I see it as a gift too," he said quietly. Frank looked around the room, seeing his control slipping away. "David, you're making the biggest mistake of your life." "No, Dad. The biggest mistake of my life was listening to you." David moved to Sarah's side, taking her hand, "and letting fear keep me from fighting for what matters most. If you choose her," Frank said, his voice cold as winter, "you're no longer my son." The words hung in the study like a curse. Michael moved to his father's other side, creating a united front against his grandfather's hatred. "Then I guess I'm no longer your son," David said simply. Frank stared at his son, his grandson, and the woman who had somehow dismantled his carefully ordered world simply by being genuinely good. For a moment, Sarah almost felt sorry for him, a man so trapped by his own prejudices that he'd destroyed his family to defend them. "You'll regret this," Frank said finally. "All of you." "Maybe," David replied. "But I'd regret losing them more." As they left Frank's study, Sarah felt as if she were emerging from a dark cave into sunlight. The battle wasn't over. She still needed to rebuild her reputation, and David still needed to prove that love could bridge the gap between their worlds. But for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, love would be enough. David's penthouse felt different when seen through Sarah's eyes. She stood in the living room, taking in the expensive art and designer furniture, while Michael gave her an excited tour. "And this is where I do homework," Michael said, showing off a desk that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. "Mrs. Henderson makes me sit here for 2 hours every day, even on weekends." "Mrs. Henderson?" Sarah asked. "His nanny," David explained, watching Sarah's reaction carefully. "She's been with us since Maria died." Sarah nodded, trying to reconcile the modest man she'd known with the obvious wealth surrounding her. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of Central Park that real estate agents described with words like breathtaking and exclusive. It was beautiful, but it felt like a museum, impressive but untouchable. "Are you okay?" David asked, noticing her silence. "It's just very different from what I imagined. Different from the Bronx apartment where Joe Harrison would have lived." Sarah smiled ruefully. Joe Harrison's apartment would have had mismatched furniture and photos stuck to the refrigerator with magnets. "This looks like something from a magazine." Michael tugged on Sarah's hand. "Want to see my room? It's not as fancy as Dad makes it sound." Michael's bedroom offered the first glimpse of real life in the pristine penthouse. Toys scattered on the floor, homework papers covering his desk, and a bed that clearly wasn't made by housekeeping staff. On his nightstand, Sarah noticed a framed photo of herself, David, and Michael from their day at the Bronx Zoo, one of their happiest moments together. "You kept this?" she asked softly. "I kept it secret from Grandpa Frank," Michael confided. "He said mean things about you, but I knew they weren't true." Sarah sat on Michael's bed, pulling him close. "Mijo, your grandfather isn't evil. He's just scared." "Scared of what?" Sarah glanced at David, who was leaning against the doorframe with an unreadable expression. "Scared that people from different backgrounds can't really love each other. Scared that everything he believes about the world might be wrong." "But that's silly," Michael said with childhood logic. "Love isn't about money." "No, it's not." Sarah kissed the top of his head. "But some people think it is." Later, after Michael had fallen asleep, David and Sarah sat on the terrace overlooking Manhattan. The city sparkled below them like scattered diamonds, beautiful and distant. "I've been thinking about what you said," David began carefully, "about Joe Harrison from the Bronx versus David Harrison from the Upper East Side. And the truth is, I don't know who the real David Harrison is anymore." He turned to face her. "For 3 months I got to be someone different, someone who worried about rent and shared dinners from takeout containers and felt like he belonged somewhere. You belonged with us because of who you were, not where you came from." "Did I? Because looking back, I wonder if I was just playing a part. Rich man slumming it, enjoying the novelty of ordinary life." Sarah considered this. "Do you remember the night Michael had a fever? When we couldn't afford to take him to the emergency room, so we stayed up all night with cold compresses and children's aspirin?" "Yes. You were terrified, real terror, not performance. You held him and sang the same lullaby over and over because you thought it might help." Sarah's voice softened. "That wasn't Joe Harrison from the Bronx. That was just a father who loved his son." David was quiet for a long moment. "I used to sing that lullaby to Michael when he was a baby. Maria taught it to me." "What happened to her, if you don't mind me asking?" "Breast cancer, diagnosed when Michael was 6, gone by the time he turned 7. David's voice carried the familiar weight of old grief. She was a lot like you, actually. Not in background, her family had money, but in spirit. She saw good in everyone." "She sounds wonderful." "She was. And she would have loved you." David paused. "She also would have been furious with me for the lies I told." Sarah reached for his hand. "David, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest." "Okay. That first day in Times Square, was any of it real? Or was I just a social experiment that got out of hand?" David was quiet for so long that Sarah began to worry she'd pushed too hard. Finally he spoke. "The plan was real. The test was real. But the moment you sat down and started talking to us," he shook his head. "Sarah, I'd been dead inside for 3 years, going through the motions of living but not really feeling anything. And then you looked at Michael like he mattered, like he was more than just some homeless kid on the street. You made me remember what it felt like to be human." "So what happens now?" Sarah asked. "Do we pretend the last month never happened? Do we start over?" "I don't know if we can start over. Too much has happened." David turned to face her fully. "But maybe we can start forward. Build something new that's based on truth instead of lies." Sarah looked out at the city lights, thinking about everything that had brought them to this moment. "Your father was right about one thing. We come from very different worlds." "Yes, we do. And there will be people who think I'm with you for your money." "Probably. And people who think you're slumming it with the help." David winced. "Unfortunately, yes." Sarah stood up, moving to the terrace railing. "But here's what your father didn't understand. Love isn't about whether 2 people are the same. It's about whether they make each other better." "Do I make you better?" David asked, joining her at the railing. "You make me believe in possibilities I never imagined," Sarah said honestly. "But you also broke my heart in ways I'm still trying to heal from. And you make me want to be worthy of the man you thought I was," David replied. "But I know I have to earn your trust back." They stood together in comfortable silence, the weight of their shared history settling between them like a bridge they weren't sure they were ready to cross. "I have one condition," Sarah said finally. "What's that?" "No more tests, no more lies. If we do this, if we try to build something real, it has to be based on who we actually are." David nodded. "Deal. But I have a condition too, which is, give me the chance to prove that David Harrison can love you just as much as Joe Harrison did." Sarah studied his face in the city lights, seeing hope and fear and determination in equal measure. "Okay," she said quietly. "But David." "Yes? If you break my heart again, There won't be a third chance. David understood. Trust, once broken, was a fragile thing. But as they stood together on the terrace, looking out at the city that had brought them together and torn them apart, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, Frank's disapproval, society's judgment, the practical questions of how to blend their different worlds. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, they were together. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to start building something real. St. Patrick's Cathedral had never felt more imposing than on David and Sarah's wedding day. The Gothic spires reached toward heaven while inside, 200 guests filled the pews. Society figures who'd known David since childhood mixed uneasily with Sarah's friends from the Bronx and Queens. Sarah stood in the bride's preparation room, wearing Maria's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame. Mrs. Patterson, her elderly former employer who'd become a surrogate mother, fussed with the veil. "You look radiant, mija," said Carmen Rodriguez, Sarah's best friend from high school, who'd flown in from Puerto Rico to serve as maid of honor. "Like a princess." "I feel like I'm about to walk into battle," Sarah admitted, checking her reflection one final time. The 6 months since their reconciliation had been a whirlwind. David had spent weeks rebuilding Sarah's reputation, personally calling every employer Frank had poisoned against her. He'd also established the Sarah Martinez Education Fund, offering scholarships to young women from underprivileged backgrounds, his way of honoring the woman he'd fallen in love with. Sarah had moved slowly, testing David's commitment at every step. When he'd proposed, not with an expensive ring but with a simple band and a promise to spend their lives proving love was stronger than circumstance, she'd said yes, but insisted on a long engagement. "Mrs. Harrison wants to see you," Michael announced, bursting into the preparation room in his miniature tuxedo. At 10 years old, he'd grown more confident, more sure of his place in their unconventional family. "Mrs. Harrison?" Sarah asked. "Grandma Elena, Dad's mom," Michael explained. "She's been asking to meet you all morning." Sarah exchanged glances with Carmen. David's mother had been notably absent during their courtship, supposedly traveling in Europe. Her return for the wedding had surprised everyone. Elena Harrison waited in the cathedral's side chapel, a woman in her 70s who carried herself with the kind of natural elegance that couldn't be bought. Unlike her husband's cold calculation, Elena radiated warmth tempered by wisdom. "So you're the woman who captured my son's heart," Elena said, studying Sarah with intelligent eyes, "and survived my husband's attempts to destroy you. Mrs. Harrison, Eleanor, please." The older woman smiled, and Sarah saw where David had inherited his genuine warmth. "I owe you an apology, dear. I should have been here to support you both. Instead, I let fear of Frank's disapproval keep me away." "Where is he? Your husband?" Eleanor's expression hardened slightly. "Frank has chosen not to attend. He's struggling with the idea that his worldview might be incomplete." Sarah nodded, unsurprised but still hurt. Despite everything, she'd held a small hope that Frank might see past his prejudices to support his son's happiness. "His loss," Elena continued firmly, "because I can see what you've done for David. He's alive again, Sarah. For the first time since Maria died, he's truly alive." The cathedral bells began to toll, signaling the ceremony's start. Elena took Sarah's hands in her own. "Welcome to the family, dear. The real family, not the one Frank tried to impose on us all." The processional began with Michael serving as ring-bearer, his proud grin visible even from the back of the cathedral. Carmen followed as maid of honor, her presence a bridge between Sarah's past and future. Then Sarah stepped into the main aisle, her arm linked with Mrs. Patterson's, the woman who'd volunteered to give her away when Sarah mentioned having no family. The cathedral fell silent except for the organ's majestic notes. David stood at the altar in his black tuxedo, but his eyes were only for her. Beside him, his best man, James, shifted nervously. Their friendship had survived David's unconventional romance, though not without some difficult conversations. Halfway down the aisle, Sarah noticed a commotion near the main doors. Frank Harrison stood there in an expensive suit, his face set in stern lines. For a moment, Sarah's step faltered. Had he come to support them after all? Frank's voice rang out across the cathedral. "Stop this ceremony." 200 heads turned toward him as he strode down the center aisle, carrying a leather portfolio. "I have evidence that this woman is not who she claims to be." David moved toward his father, his face dark with fury. "Dad, don't do this. Someone has to protect this family's honor." Frank reached the altar and pulled documents from his portfolio. "Sarah Martinez has a criminal record. Theft, fraud, identity theft, it's all here." Gasps echoed through the cathedral. Sarah felt the world tilt around her as Frank brandished what appeared to be official court documents bearing her name. "Those are fake," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the cathedral's acoustics. "Are they?" Frank looked around at the assembled guests with theatrical indignation. "Judge Morrison, would you examine these documents? As a federal judge, your expertise would be invaluable." An elderly man in the third pew stood reluctantly. Sarah recognized him from newspaper photos, a respected jurist whose opinion carried significant weight in New York society. Before Judge Morrison could reach the altar, Michael stepped forward. From his tiny tuxedo pocket, he pulled out a familiar digital recorder. "Grandpa Frank, you're lying again," Michael announced, his young voice carrying remarkable authority. "And I have proof." Frank's face went pale as Michael pressed play. His own voice filled the cathedral. "I need documents showing criminal history. Make it convincing, theft charges, fraud, something that would horrify a judge. Yes, I know it's forgery, but it needs to look official enough to stop the wedding." The recording continued, revealing Frank's plan in damning detail. He'd hired a forger to create fake criminal records, timing their revelation for maximum humiliation. Judge Morrison examined the documents Frank had presented, his experienced eye quickly identifying the forgeries. "Mr. Harrison," he said formally, "these documents are fraudulent. The seals are incorrect, the case numbers don't match proper format, and the signatures are clearly forged." The cathedral buzzed with shocked whispers. Frank stood frozen, his final gambit exposed as desperate fraud. Sarah stepped forward, her wedding dress rustling in the silence. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice carrying both strength and compassion, "I forgive you." The simple words seemed to echo infinitely in the cathedral's vast space. "I forgive you for trying to destroy me. I forgive you for lying about me. I forgive you for trying to ruin your son's happiness." Sarah's voice grew stronger. "But I will not forgive you if you continue to poison this family with your hatred." Frank stared at her, his face cycling through emotions, rage, humiliation, and something that might have been shame. "You think your forgiveness matters to me?" he said finally. "No," Sarah replied honestly, "but it matters to me. And it matters to David. And most importantly, it matters to Michael, a little boy who deserves to have a grandfather who loves him more than he loves his own prejudices." Michael walked over to his grandfather, looking up at him with 10-year-old seriousness. "Grandpa Frank, I love you, but you're being mean to my mom, and that's not okay." Frank looked down at his grandson, the boy he'd claimed to be protecting, and saw reflected there the same disappointment he'd been carrying his entire adult life. "The ceremony will continue," Father Miguel announced from the altar. "Mr. Harrison, you're welcome to stay and witness your son's happiness, or you can leave, but you will not disrupt this sacred moment further." Frank looked around the cathedral, at the guests who now viewed him with contempt, at his son who'd chosen love over family approval, at his grandson who'd recorded his schemes, and at the woman whose grace had just shown him exactly what kind of man he'd become. Without a word, Frank Harrison walked back down the aisle and out of the cathedral, leaving behind the son who'd defied him and the family he'd tried so hard to protect that he'd destroyed it instead. As the doors closed behind him, David took Sarah's hands at the altar. "Where were we?" he asked, smiling through tears. "I believe you were about to marry the woman you love," Father Miguel replied. And in the soaring beauty of St. Patrick's Cathedral, surrounded by people who'd chosen to celebrate love over prejudice, David Harrison married Sarah Martinez, two souls who'd found each other, despite every obstacle their different worlds had placed between them. When they kissed, sealing their union, the congregation erupted in applause that seemed to reach the cathedral's highest arches, drowning out any echoes of hatred that might have lingered in the sacred space. The law offices of Stewart Morrison and Associates occupied an entire floor of a granite building in Lower Manhattan. 3 weeks after the wedding, David, Sarah, and Michael sat across from attorney Thomas Stewart, a distinguished man in his 50s who specialized in cases involving fraud and harassment. "The evidence is overwhelming," Stewart said, reviewing the files spread across his conference table. We have recorded admissions of conspiracy, documented forgery, intentional interference with employment and harassment. Your father could face significant criminal charges. Michael's recordings had provided prosecutors with a roadmap of Frank's systematic campaign. Every phone call, every manipulative scheme, every attempt to destroy Sarah's life, all documented in Frank's own voice. What kind of charges? David asked. Fraud, forgery, criminal harassment, conspiracy. We're looking at potentially 2 to 6 years in prison. Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions. Justice demanded consequences for Frank's actions, but the idea of sending David's father to prison sat uneasily with her. There's another option, Stewart continued. A plea agreement that would involve financial restitution, public apology, and supervised community service instead of prison time. What do you think? David asked Sarah. Sarah looked at Michael, who was quietly coloring in a sketchpad but clearly listening to every word. What do you think, mijo? Michael put down his crayon. Grandpa Frank did really bad things, but he's still my grandpa. Maybe he could say sorry and help people instead of going to jail. From the mouths of babes, Sarah thought. Even after everything Frank had put them through, Michael still saw his grandfather's potential for redemption. I'd like to meet with Frank before we proceed, Sarah said. Face to face, just the two of us. David frowned. Sarah, I don't think that's a good idea. He can't hurt me anymore, Sarah said quietly. His power came from secrets and lies. Now everything's in the open. 2 days later, Sarah sat in the visitors area of Rikers Island, waiting for Frank Harrison to be brought out. The setting was deliberately chosen. She wanted him to see exactly where his actions might lead. Frank appeared escorted by a guard, wearing the standard orange jumpsuit that reduced all inmates to the same level. 3 weeks of confinement had aged him visibly. His silver hair was uncombed, his usually perfect posture slumped with defeat. You came, he said, sitting across from her at the metal table. Yes. Why? Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of the man who'd terrorized her for months. Instead, she saw someone who looked smaller, deflated by the consequences of his own hatred. Because your grandson asked me to. Frank's composure cracked slightly. Michael? He loves you. Despite everything you've done, he still loves you. And that breaks my heart, Mr. Harrison. Not for me, but for him, because he shouldn't have to choose between loving his grandfather and protecting his family. I was protecting... No. Sarah's voice was firm, but not angry. You were protecting your own fears. Your belief that people like me couldn't possibly love people like David genuinely. Your terror that your worldview might be wrong. Frank was silent for a long moment. You could have taken everything. Millions in civil damages. You could have destroyed me completely. Yes, I could have. But what would that teach Michael? That love is about revenge? That families are supposed to hurt each other? So what do you want? Sarah leaned forward. I want you to tell me why you hate me so much. Not what you think I represent. Not what you're afraid I might do. Tell me why you hate Sarah Martinez. The question seemed to catch Frank off guard. He sat quietly for nearly a minute before answering. I don't hate you, he said finally. I hate what you represent. Which is? Change. The possibility that everything I was taught about social order and natural hierarchies might be... He struggled with the words. Wrong. Your son fell in love, Mr. Harrison. That's not a threat to social order, it's just love. Frank's hands clenched on the metal table. My father built Harrison Construction from nothing. He taught me that success meant elevation, that each generation should rise higher than the last. David marrying beneath his station felt like failure? Like abandonment of everything our family worked for. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. Your grandfather built the company from nothing, which means he was probably looked down on by established families. He probably faced the same prejudices you're showing me. Frank looked startled, as if he'd never considered this parallel. But here's what you missed, Mr. Harrison. David didn't marry beneath his station. He married someone who makes him better. Someone who loves your grandson unconditionally. Someone who sees your family's potential for goodness, despite all evidence to the contrary. You think I have potential for goodness? Sarah smiled sadly. I think you love your family. I think your methods were terrible, but your motivation came from love. Misguided, prejudiced, destructive love, but love nonetheless. Frank stared at the table between them. What happens now? That depends on you. The prosecutors have enough evidence to put you in prison for years. Or you can accept a plea agreement that includes restitution, public apology, and community service. What kind of community service? Working with immigrant families, helping people who are starting with nothing build better lives for their children, people like your grandfather once was. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. And if I refuse, then you go to prison, and Michael grows up knowing his grandfather chose pride over family. Frank was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I'm sorry. I know you are. But Mr. Harrison, I'm not the one who most needs to hear that apology. 1 week later, Frank Harrison stood in the offices of the New York Times, reading aloud a prepared statement to a room full of reporters. I, Frank Harrison, publicly apologize to Sarah Martinez Harrison for my unconscionable campaign of harassment and defamation. My actions were motivated by prejudice and fear, and they have no justification. Ms. Harrison is a woman of impeccable character who has brought nothing but joy to my family. I deeply regret my behavior and am committed to making amends through community service and personal growth. The story ran on the front page of the next day's edition, along with a sidebar about the growing number of cross-class marriages in American society. Frank's public humiliation was complete, but so was his first step toward redemption. That evening, David, Sarah, and Michael sat in their living room. Sarah had moved into the penthouse, but she'd insisted on redecorating to make it feel more like a home. Reading the newspaper coverage. Do you think Grandpa Frank really means it? Michael asked. Sarah ruffled his hair. I think your grandpa is learning that being wrong about something doesn't make you a bad person. That just makes you human. Will you forgive him if he tries to be better? Sarah exchanged glances with David. Forgiveness isn't something you earn, mijo. It's something you give. But trust? That has to be earned. 3 months later, Frank Harrison began his court-ordered community service at the Lower East Side Family Center, helping recent immigrants navigate job applications and housing searches. He worked alongside former cleaning ladies, construction workers, and single mothers, people he'd once dismissed as beneath his notice. It would be years before Frank truly changed. But on a cold Thursday in March, when he helped a young Dominican father fill out paperwork to start his own landscaping business, Frank Harrison began to understand what his daughter-in-law had been trying to tell him, that love wasn't about elevation or social order. Sometimes love was simply about seeing the humanity in people who were different from yourself, and sometimes that was enough to begin building bridges across the chasms that prejudice had created. 2 years later, Sarah stood in the nursery of their Upper East Side home, rocking 18-month-old Emma Harrison to sleep. The room was a perfect blend of luxury and warmth, expensive furniture softened by handmade blankets from Sarah's friends in the Bronx, designer mobiles hanging beside family photos that told the story of their unconventional journey. Mama, Emma murmured sleepily, her tiny fist clutching Sarah's finger with the perfect trust of childhood. Sí, mi amor, Sarah whispered, switching effortlessly between English and Spanish, as she always did with both children. Mama's here. Through the window she could see Central Park, where Michael was playing soccer with friends, a mix of kids from his private school and children from the after-school program Sarah had started. At 12, Michael had inherited his father's business sense and his stepmother's social consciousness, often organizing fundraisers for causes he learned about through Sarah's work. How are my girls? David asked, appearing in the doorway with that soft expression he wore whenever he watched Sarah with Emma. Just finishing our story, Sarah replied, settling Emma in her crib and joining David in the hallway. They walked hand in hand through their home, past walls that now displayed Sarah's Puerto Rican heritage, alongside Harrison family portraits. David had insisted on honoring both of their backgrounds, creating a space that felt authentically theirs rather than just his. The foundation board meeting is tomorrow, David mentioned as they reached the living room. Are you ready for the presentation? Sarah smiled, feeling the familiar thrill of anticipation. The Hope Foundation had grown beyond their wildest expectations, starting as a small scholarship program and evolving into a comprehensive support system for underprivileged families. They now operated 3 community centers, provided educational grants to over 200 students, and had created jobs for dozens of people from backgrounds similar to Sarah's. Mrs. Rodriguez called this afternoon, Sarah said. Remember Luz Morales, the young woman whose college tuition we paid? She graduated last month with her nursing degree and wants to volunteer at the Bronx Center. That's incredible. David pulled Sarah close, still amazed by the ripple effects of their work. Do you ever think about how different things might have been if I hadn't done that stupid test in Times Square? Sarah considered this. Sometimes. But then I think about all the people we've helped, all the lives that have been changed because of what grew from that moment. Maybe everything happened exactly the way it was supposed to. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. David opened it to find Frank Harrison standing in the hallway, holding a small, wrapped gift and looking uncertain. Dad. David's voice was carefully neutral. Relations with Frank had improved slowly over the past 2 years, but trust remained fragile. I hope I'm not intruding, Frank said. I wanted to see Emma before I left for Chicago. Frank's community service had evolved into genuine passion for immigrant advocacy. He now worked full-time with a non-profit organization, using his business connections to create job opportunities for people starting over in America. The transformation wasn't complete. Decades of prejudice didn't disappear overnight, but the effort was genuine. Come in, Sarah said warmly. Emma just fell asleep, but she'd love to see her abuelo. Frank's face lit up at the Spanish endearment. Sarah had started calling him abuelo months ago, recognizing his need to belong in their bilingual household. It was a small gesture that carried enormous meaning. In the nursery, Frank stood beside Emma's crib with the reverence of a man who'd learned to appreciate second chances. She's beautiful, he whispered. She looks like Maria did as a baby. Sarah placed a gentle hand on his arm. She has your eyes, actually. The same intelligence, the same determination. Frank looked at Sarah with something approaching wonder. Even after everything he'd put her through, she continued to find ways to include him in their family story. I have news, Frank said as they returned to the living room. The Chicago program has offered me a permanent position. Director of Corporate Partnerships. That's wonderful, David said, meaning it. You've earned it. I wanted to ask, Frank hesitated, looking older than his 64 years. Would it be all right if I came back for Emma's birthday? And perhaps Christmas? Of course, Sarah answered before David could speak. Your family, Frank. You'll always be welcome here. The simple acceptance seemed to overwhelm Frank. His eyes filled with tears as he looked around the living room, where Spanish music played softly in the background, where his son's children felt equally comfortable with expensive toys and handmade crafts from their Puerto Rican extended family. I was so wrong about you, Frank said quietly to Sarah, about everything. You weren't wrong to love your family, Sarah replied. You were just wrong about how to protect them. But we all make mistakes when we're afraid. Later that evening, after Frank had left and the children were asleep, David and Sarah sat on their terrace overlooking the city that had brought them together. Sarah was reviewing applications for the Foundation's new scholarship program when David noticed her smile. Good news? Carmen's daughter is applying, Sarah said, showing him the application. She wants to study social work, just like I always dreamed of doing. David remembered Carmen from their wedding, Sarah's best friend who'd flown in from Puerto Rico. She's following in your footsteps. Better than my footsteps. She'll have opportunities I never imagined possible. Sarah set the application aside and looked out at the city lights. David, can I ask you something? Anything. Do you ever regret the life you might have had? If you'd married someone from your own world, someone who understood society parties and charity galas. David was quiet for a moment, considering. You mean someone like Madison Cooper? Madison had married a hedge fund manager 6 months after David and Sarah's wedding, a union that Frank had probably orchestrated before his downfall. The marriage had lasted 18 months before ending in a spectacularly public divorce. I think about it sometimes, David admitted. That version of my life would have been easier in some ways. No cultural bridges to build, no prejudices to overcome, no reporters asking about our unusual love story. Sarah felt a flicker of old insecurity. And it would have been empty. Comfortable, socially acceptable, completely empty. David turned to face her fully. Sarah, that life would have been about maintaining appearances. This life is about building something real. Even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult, the best things are never easy. David reached for her hand. Besides, I like our version better. Michael speaks 3 languages now. Emma will grow up understanding both sides of her heritage, and I get to fall asleep every night next to the woman who gave away her last $14 because she thought a child might be hungry. Sarah smiled, remembering that cold October day in Times Square that had changed everything. That woman had no idea what she was getting into. Neither did the man pretending to be homeless. But maybe that was the point. We both had to become people we'd never been before. As if summoned by their conversation, Michael appeared on the terrace in his pajamas. "I can't sleep," he announced, settling between them on the outdoor couch with the confidence of a child who knew he was loved. "Bad dreams?" Sarah asked, pulling him close. "Good dreams, actually. But I wanted to tell you about my idea for the foundation." At 12, Michael had inherited both parents' passion for helping others. His latest project involved organizing his private school classmates to mentor kids from the community centers Sarah had established. "What's your idea, buddy?" David asked. "A summer camp, but not just any camp. One where rich kids and poor kids do everything together, like really together. They'd room together, eat together, do projects together." Sarah exchanged glances with David over Michael's head. The idea was brilliant in its simplicity, breaking down barriers by eliminating them entirely. "That's a wonderful idea, mijo," Sarah said. "What made you think of it? Remember how Dad pretended to be poor to test people? Well, what if instead of testing, we just mixed everyone up? So kids like me could learn what it's like to not have everything, and kids like you used to be could see that rich kids aren't all spoiled brats." The wisdom of children, Sarah thought, never ceased to amaze her. "We'd need insurance, facilities, trained counselors," David began, his business mind already working through logistics. "And we'd need to convince parents on both sides," Sarah added. "Rich parents might worry about their children's safety. Poor parents might feel like charity cases. Or," Michael said with 12-year-old optimism, "maybe they'd just see what we see, that kids are kids, no matter where they come from." As they sat together on the terrace, planning Michael's vision for bridging social divides, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From that first test in Times Square to Frank's redemption, from public scandal to genuine acceptance, their love had survived every challenge because it was built on truth, forgiveness, and the radical belief that people from different worlds could create something beautiful together. "I love our life," Sarah said quietly, encompassing all of it, the successes and struggles, the joy and occasional heartache, the messy, beautiful reality of loving across differences. "Even when it's complicated?" David asked. "Especially when it's complicated," Sarah replied, echoing his earlier words. "The complicated parts are where the real love lives." Above them, the stars shone down on Manhattan, the same stars that had witnessed a desperate test of character, become a love story that would inspire others to believe in the possibility of connection across any divide. In their home, Emma slept peacefully in her crib, dreams filled with lullabies in 2 languages. Down the hall, Michael had returned to bed with his head full of plans to change the world one summer camp at a time. And on the terrace, David and Sarah Harrison sat together, 2 souls who'd found each other despite every obstacle their different worlds had placed between them, proving that love, real love, could bridge any gap if people were brave enough to build the bridge together. The test was over, the real life had begun, and it was more beautiful than either of them had ever dared to imagine. Epilogue. Full circle. 5 years later, on a crisp October morning that mirrored the day their story began, Sarah stood in Times Square holding a microphone as reporters gathered around her. The setting was deliberate. She'd insisted on this location for the press conference announcing the Hope Foundation's latest initiative. "Today we're launching the Bridge Summer Camp program," Sarah announced, her voice carrying clearly over the familiar chaos of New York's crossroads. "A space where children from all backgrounds can learn, grow, and build friendships that will last a lifetime." Behind her, a group of teenagers held a banner. "Building bridges, not walls." Among them stood 17-year-old Michael Harrison, now taller than his stepmother, his arm around Luz Morales, the young woman whose college education the foundation had funded and who now served as the program's director. "The camp is based on a simple principle," Sarah continued. "When children see past their differences to their shared humanity, they become adults who can solve problems we thought were impossible." In the crowd of reporters and onlookers, David Harrison watched his wife with the same awe he'd felt 8 years ago when she'd sat down beside two strangers and changed everything. Sarah had grown into her role as a public figure, but she'd never lost the genuine compassion that had made her give away her last $14. "Mrs. Harrison," called out a reporter from the Times, "critics say the camp is overly idealistic. How do you respond to concerns that children from different socio-economic backgrounds can't genuinely relate to each other?" Sarah smiled, an expression that carried years of hard-won wisdom. "8 years ago, my husband tested that exact theory. He disguised himself as a homeless man to see who would show kindness to strangers. That test led to our meeting, our marriage, and eventually to this foundation." She gestured around Times Square, where hundreds of people hurried past without making eye contact, just as they had the day she'd first noticed David and Michael. But here's what we learned. The problem was never whether people from different backgrounds can love each other. The problem is that we so rarely create opportunities for them to meet as equals. The Bridge Summer Camp is designed to do exactly that. "What would you say to parents who worry about their children being exposed to different value systems?" asked another reporter. "I'd say that diversity of experience makes children stronger, not weaker. My daughter Emma speaks 3 languages, understands 2 cultures, and sees helpers wherever she goes because that's how she was raised. My stepson Michael has friends from private school and friends from our community centers, and he's a better person because of it." As if summoned by the mention of her name, 6-year-old Emma wriggled through the crowd to reach Sarah's side. She'd inherited her father's business sense and her mother's warm heart, along with her grandfather Frank's determination and her late grandmother Maria's gentle spirit. "Mummy," Emma whispered loudly enough for the microphones to catch, "are you almost done? Abuelo Frank is here and he brought presents." Laughter rippled through the crowd as Sarah lifted Emma onto her hip. In the background, Frank Harrison stood with his arm around Elena Harrison, both grandparents beaming with pride at their unconventional but thriving family. "Just about finished, mi amor," Sarah said, then addressed the reporters again. "The Bridge Summer Camp opens next June with 50 children from across the 5 boroughs. We have scholarship funds available to ensure that every child who wants to attend can afford to do so." "Final question," called a young reporter Sarah didn't recognize. "Looking back, do you believe the test that started your relationship was ethical?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering her answer carefully. "My husband's test was based on a false premise, that kindness could be measured and judged like a performance. Real kindness doesn't need testing because it flows naturally from people who've learned to see everyone as deserving of compassion." She shifted Emma to her other hip and continued, "But I'm grateful it happened because it brought together 2 people who were both pretending to be someone they weren't. David pretended to be poor, and I pretended that giving away my last money didn't scare me. In the end, we both learned that love requires showing up as exactly who you are, not who you think other people want you to be." The press conference concluded, and the crowd began to disperse. David approached Sarah and Emma, wrapping them both in a hug that had become their signature. The 3 of them together, with space for Michael to join from whatever direction he happened to be approaching. "Good job, Mummy," Emma announced solemnly. "You sounded very important." "Thank you, baby, but remember, important isn't about how you sound. It's about how you help." Frank and Elena approached, followed by Michael and Luz. At 70, Frank looked younger than he had in years. His work with immigrant families had given him purpose and perspective, while Elena's unwavering support had given him the courage to change. "Sarah," Frank said, "I wanted you to know that 3 families from the Chicago program have asked if their children can attend the camp. They're willing to travel here for the summer." "That's wonderful," Sarah replied, genuinely pleased. "The more diverse our group, the stronger the bridges we can build. And," Frank continued with a slight smile, "I've convinced Harrison Construction to sponsor 10 full scholarships. David doesn't know yet, but it's my contribution to the program." David looked surprised and touched. "Dad, that's incredibly generous." "It's incredibly overdue," Frank corrected gently. "I have 8 years of generosity to make up for." Emma squirmed down from Sarah's arms and ran to her grandfather, who lifted her up with the easy affection of a man who'd learned to express love without conditions. "Abuelo, are you going to come to camp?" Emma asked. "If they'll have me," Frank replied, looking at Sarah for confirmation. "We'd be honored to have you," Sarah said, meaning it completely. As their extended family gathered in the heart of Times Square, the place where their story had begun with a test and was continuing with a promise, Sarah marveled at the unexpected paths that love could take. Michael, now 17, and preparing for college, had grown into a young man who saw service as privilege rather than obligation. Emma, at 6, moved effortlessly between worlds, equally comfortable in boardrooms and community centers. Frank had transformed from antagonist to advocate, using his privilege to lift others rather than exclude them. And David, the man who'd once tested strangers for their goodness, had learned that love wasn't something to be measured or earned, but something to be given freely and received with gratitude. "Ready to go home?" David asked, gathering their group with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd learned to coordinate large, complicated families. "Actually," Sarah said, looking around at the busy intersection where thousands of stories intersected every day, "let's walk for a bit. I want to show Emma and Michael something." She led them to the exact spot where she'd first sat down beside David and Michael 8 years ago. The red steps were still there, now surrounded by different tourists and street performers, but the energy was unchanged, desperate and hopeful, chaotic and magical. "This is where I met your father and brother," Sarah told Emma, who studied the spot with 6-year-old intensity. "It doesn't look special," Emma observed. "That's the point, Misha. Magic doesn't usually look like magic when it's happening. It just looks like regular people making choices to be kind." Michael, who remembered that day with the clarity of childhood trauma transformed into triumph, put his arm around his little sister. "It wasn't magic, Em. It was Mom Sarah being brave enough to help strangers. And your dad being foolish enough to think love could be tested," Sarah added with a smile toward David. "And all of us being lucky enough to find each other despite the odds," David concluded, pulling his wife close as their family stood together in the heart of the city that had made them. Around them, Times Square hummed with its eternal energy, millions of people rushing past each other, each carrying their own hopes and fears and dreams. But in that moment, the Harrison family stood still, connected by a love that had survived tests and trials, prejudice and pride, to become something stronger than any of them could have achieved alone. "Come on," Sarah said, taking Emma's hand while David lifted Michael onto his shoulders, despite the teenager's protests that he was too old for such displays of affection. "Let's go home and start planning how to change the world." As they walked through the crowded streets of Manhattan, Frank fell into step beside Sarah, carrying Emma's backpack and looking more relaxed than he had in decades. "Sarah," he said quietly, so only she could hear, "I need you to know something." "What's that?" "That test David did 8 years ago, it wasn't really about finding good people. It was about him feeling disconnected from the world after Maria died. He was looking for proof that genuine goodness still existed." Sarah glanced at David, who was laughing at something Michael had whispered in his ear. "And what did he find?" Frank smiled, an expression that transformed his entire face. "He found you, and you didn't just prove that goodness exists, you taught him how to be good himself. Frank, your son was always good. He just needed to remember it." "Maybe. But Sarah, what you did, forgiving me, including me in this family despite everything I put you through, that taught me something I never learned in 70 years of life, which is, that love isn't about deserving, it's about choosing. Every day, you choose to love this complicated, imperfect family. And that choice makes us all better people." Sarah squeezed his arm gently. "We choose to love you too, Frank, every day." They reached the entrance to their building, where Dorman Robert, the same security guard who'd checked Sarah's credentials at Harrison Industries years ago, greeted them with warm familiarity. "Good afternoon, Harrison family," Robert said, opening the door with a flourish. "How did the press conference go?" "Perfectly," Emma announced importantly. "Mommy was very smart and everyone listened." "Of course they did," Robert replied seriously. "Your mommy is a very wise woman." In the elevator, Sarah looked around at her family, David holding Emma, Michael texting friends about camp plans, Frank and Elena discussing logistics for the Chicago families, everyone talking over each other in the comfortable chaos of people who belonged together. "David," she said suddenly, "do you remember what you told me that first night in my apartment? About sometimes worrying that love wasn't enough?" David's expression grew tender. "I remember. What do you think now?" David looked around the elevator at the evidence of their shared life. Emma chattering in both English and Spanish, Michael planning his next service project, Frank transformed from enemy to advocate, Elena beaming with grandmother pride. "I think love isn't just enough," he said slowly. "I think it's everything, but not the feeling kind of love, the choosing kind, the kind that shows up every day and decides to build bridges instead of walls." The elevator opened onto their floor, and they spilled into the hallway like a small parade. Emma ran ahead to their door, spinning in circles because she was too excited to walk straight. "Mummy, can we call Carmen and tell her about the camp?" Emma asked as Sarah unlocked their apartment. "Of course, mi amor, and we should call Mrs. Patterson too, she might want to volunteer. And Luz's abuela," Michael added. "She always has the best stories for the kids." As they entered their home, Sarah paused in the foyer, overwhelmed by gratitude for the unlikely journey that had brought them all together. The walls were covered with photos that told their story. David and Sarah's wedding, Emma's first steps, Michael's graduation from middle school, Frank volunteering at community centers, family vacations that included everyone from Elena to Carmen to Mrs. Patterson. "You know what we need?" David said, watching Sarah take in their life displayed on the walls. "What?" "A new photo, right here in Times Square, where it all began. The whole family, exactly as we are now." Sarah smiled, thinking of how different that photo would be from the one that might have been taken 8 years ago. "I'd like that, but not posed, not perfect. Just us, being us. Just us, being us," David agreed, pulling her close as their family scattered through the apartment with the comfortable chaos of people who knew they were home. And in that moment, Sarah Martinez Harrison understood that the greatest test wasn't the one David had devised in Times Square all those years ago. The greatest test was showing up every day to love people who were different from you, who challenged you, who needed you to be better than you thought you could be. They had all passed that test, not because they were perfect, but because they had learned to choose love over fear, forgiveness over resentment, and hope over cynicism. In the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.